For more on this, we are now joined by Hugo Pienaar, Chief Economist at Bureau for Economic Research, and he joins us for an overall discussion on the economic burden caused by COVID-19 infections, and he joins us via our phone line. Hugo, thank you so much for joining us here on the late edition. Perhaps let's start here. What is the overall impact that COVID-19 caused, not just in the healthcare sector, but overall in the country?
Thank you very much, and good evening to you and the viewers and listeners. So, of course, it was a sort of, people refer to it as a 100-year event or 100-year shock. And certainly, if we look at the macroeconomy, it was very dramatic. So perhaps let's just start at the broad aggregate numbers. So real GDP, the level of GDP in South Africa, or gross domestic product, so the broadest measure of economic activity in the country, that contracted by 6% in 2020. So you have to go back literally 100 years to find a contraction in South Africa on an annual basis of that amount. In the second quarter of 2020, which of course was the hardest lockdown part, South Africa lost a staggering 2.2 million jobs. And then I think one can look at the fiscal implications, so the implications on government debt. And our debt level went up from 57% of GDP to 70% of GDP in fiscal year 2020. Now that was, of course, as government revenue came down very sharply because of this large contraction in the economy I mentioned, and also because of increased government expenditure to try and support the economy. And perhaps the final point to make is of course on the educational side. So we are still suffering from the learning losses that learners experienced during COVID-19. So all in all, it was a very, and I guess this is an obvious point to make, but it was a very, very severe impact across the board.
And Hugo, when you speak about jobs, you're saying that we saw the second quarter in 2020, 2.2 million job losses. And one would just say that it's quite clear that many businesses and small businesses suffered in this regard.
Yeah, 100%. So, I mean, and as we know, many businesses were literally shut for weeks on end. Now, if you are a large corporate with deep pockets, you can sort of, well, even then it was a struggle, but you could sort of ride it through. But a small sort of business, it became very difficult to survive during those periods. Now, of course, there were sort of the banks had some exceptions that they made. There were some government support, but some of these support measures only came later, or it took quite a while for these support measures to reach companies. So 100%, many companies went under, unfortunately, or did not survive that hard lockdown.
And Hugo, what would you say when it comes to, what economic burdens people are left with? Surely a number of people are still reeling from COVID-19.
So the one can think of or look at is employment. So we have the actual data up to the first quarter of this year. And even by that point, so now we are sort of almost 3 years after I was going to say the darkest point of the pandemic, 3 years after the fact, the level of total employment in South Africa, according to Statistics South Africa, was still 190,000 below where it was in the first quarter of 2020. So 190,000 below before COVID really hit. So there is, on the employment side, certainly there is a lagging impact. We're still sitting with the fiscal impact. Our debt levels have not come down to what they were before COVID, and they are very unlikely to do so. So again, you are correct. There are sort of lasting impacts of that shock.
How does the country recover from something like this, especially during a time where many South Africans are also facing another burden, which is load shedding?
So I think this is an important point, whereas some of our peer countries recovered faster than South Africa for several reasons. The one was that they had more ammunition on the fiscal side, so they could cut taxes more, or they could increase expenditure by more to support their economies. But then, besides that, several other countries did not have, I was going to say, the non-COVID shocks that South Africa has seen over the last 3 years. Now, you've mentioned load shedding, but of course, besides that, we had the July riots in 2021 in KZN and parts of Gauteng. That was a major setback to our COVID or post-COVID recovery. And then we had the dreadful floods last year in April in KwaZulu-Natal, which also set back our recovery. So even in the absence of COVID, the last 3 years have been or would have been quite tense. So COVID just exacerbated that tremendously.
And Hugo, maybe can a country prepare better economically, when it comes to, things like a pandemic, which really caught many countries off guard?
Sorry, sorry, I couldn't quite hear the last part of your question.
I was just saying that, can a country prepare better economically so that, you are not caught off guard by a pandemic?
So, okay. So I think we were well prepared on the monetary policy, so the policy that the Reserve Bank puts in place. So they ensured that our inflation rate was low going into the pandemic, and that allowed the Reserve Bank to reduce the interest rate aggressively during COVID in order to support the economy. So I think we did quite well on the monetary side. Where we did not do well was on the fiscal side. So to answer your question, I think what countries can do is to ensure that their debt levels remain well under control, so that they have buffers when these shocks hit, that they are able to stimulate their economy by increasing expenditure and or cutting taxes. South Africa was in a position where our fiscal balances did not allow us to stimulate the economy to the same extent than some other countries did. So I think that is an important lesson to take forward.
All right, Hugo, thank you so much for your contribution. That is Hugo Pienaar, Chief Economist at Bureau for Economic Research.